Hello, everybody. I'm here with our contributor, Greg. He is a young liberal in the Australian Young Liberal movement. We're going to talk a little bit about Australia today. I think that there's a lot of interesting things that we can discuss in terms of the movement for freedom. So, Greg, thanks for joining me, and let's get right into it. Obviously, there was an election this year where the Liberal Party in coalition with their coalition partners, the Nationals, went down to defeat, and a pretty decisive defeat as well. Could you give us just a brief rundown on what happened 6 months ago and why you think it happened?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
So essentially, what happened in May 2022, we had an election where the coalition went from 76 seats to 58 seats. And in the Australian House of Representatives, you need 76 seats to form government. And Labor scraped through to have 77 seats in the House of Representatives, which means that Labor is now the government. But what was amazing about that election was that both major parties had a swing against them, but yet Labor somehow managed to pick up those seats that they needed to form government, and that's because of our preferential voting system. But another key element of that election was the so-called teal independents running in very blue ribbon seats of Liberal parties, such as Kooyong, where Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, under the previous government, lost his seat. And this was mainly in Victoria and New South Wales, where moderate inner city Liberals, lost their seats to teal independents who are running on climate change and corruption and treatment of women. It's ironic how they were talking about diversity, but yet all of them are white women, white middle-aged women, but I digress. And the reason why we lost is simply because we went too moderate. Scott Morrison and his team and the leadership team allowed allowed the government of the day to essentially go left wing. So, but to be fair to Labor, they did come more towards the centre. But the Liberal Party, especially the leadership of Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg, went to the left. That means that we lost our base. We lost those voters who voted for us because we are the Liberal Party. We are supposed to be liberal, but the last election we were not liberal. For example, in the 2019 election, we were elected on a mandate of coal, essentially, especially in Queensland, where we had a very pro-fossil fuel stance. But however, there was also other factors in the election, such as Bill Shorten, who proposed ridiculous policies to essentially increase this tax, increase that tax, and essentially hurt middle-income Australia. But what happened? So yes, we went too far to the left. We lost our base, and people just fled the Liberal Party left, right, and centre. And what another thing didn't help was the pre-selection battle in New South Wales, which is a state in Australia, where Scott Morrison and his team once again essentially handpicked moderate candidates, but the party base didn't want those candidates. They wanted hard right, very right wing, economically freedom thinking people in those seats for the Liberal Party, running in those seats for the Liberal Party instead of the handpicked moderate centre right moderate faction led by Scott Morrison and Alex Hawke, who used their factional influence to ensure that the moderate faction was boosted up. And I think that's the reason why we lost that. It was certainly within our control. Obviously, there's the international circumstances, such as the war in Ukraine, which put pressure on energy prices, and the cost of living started to increase as well. But also, you had the post-pandemic economic boom, which essentially $200 billion of government money was coming out into the economy. So inflation started to pick up, cost of living was starting to become an issue. And speaking about cost of living, it is really hard at the moment for especially to middle and lower income Australians who, with rising interest rates from the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is your version of the Fed, the Federal Reserve of the United States, they are putting up interest rates at a rate never seen before. So in April of this year, interest rates were 0.1%. They are now at 2.8% in November 2022, and they're expected to peak at around 4%, depending on um, which bank you ask. And they're always updating their forecasts to have it more to have a higher and higher. And in the last budget, energy prices are going to go up by 55%. Gas prices are going to go up by another 45%. And there's not even a word of the word mortgage within the budget papers that was recently released. And this is really concerning because household budgets are going to get squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, and the government is being pressured by the media and by the Greens in the Senate to introduce price caps, to introduce a windfall tax on profits of the oil and gas companies who are supposedly exploiting the high prices caused by. And it's a really dangerous time for Australia, and this is why I've joined the Liberal Party, to make it more right wing, to make it more economically freedom orientated, because that's what young people are looking for. Just before this show, I was looking with you, Marcus, into the polls of various economically related questions, and the general trend is that younger people think more economically uh, free compared to their older counterparts. For example, 40% of the people who said that the government should stay out of the economy more was young people aged between 18 and 35. And I'm really positive about that. I'm really happy about that. It shows that the shift and the questioning of government is happening, and that hopefully Australia can produce really good economically freedom based politicians who can then take that ideology to the relevant state and federal parliaments to essentially to do the three-step process of deregulate, cut spending, and then cut taxes. I'm really looking forward to what the Liberal Party has in the future, and just generally the population of Australia, because judging by that trend, we are getting more and more economically free, and this is a great opportunity for Australia to be finally unleashed, to have that economic potential, to have GDP growth figures up into the high fours and the low 5% to actually get Australia moving. And I'm really looking forward to what the Liberal Party can produce as well, because within the young Liberal movement, we are essentially, most of the people that I've talked to are very right wing and very economically freedom orientated, because they understand that if you actually allow people more economic freedom, more and the ability to take full opportunity of what's been given to you, then people's lives will get better. And this comes back to Ayn Rand's philosophy of, it's your life, you should take the full opportunity what you have been given, and government shouldn't be in the way as much it is now, because right now it is just absolutely ridiculous at how the government is essentially coercing people to do what the government seeks what the government thinks in turn what the government thinks sees fit for the individual person to do, which is just absolutely ridiculous. People should do what they see fit, and I don't care what people do as long as they don't harm other people. And this is where private property rights come in. Now, the reason why mortgage rates are going up in this country is because of the mishandling of regulations around housing across Australia. Australia's properties, the Australian property market is significantly overvalued because of our policy around the tax code, the central bank, and regulations, especially with zoning laws. For example, one of my colleagues is building a new house, and it took up to a year for the council to approve of the house design. So in Australia, depending on your local council, which is your counties, you have to submit your house plan to the local government, and then it's up to local government to approve it or not. And this approval process can take ages. So this colleague of mine submitted their first approach to the builder in May 2019, and the house is still ongoing in terms of construction. It's almost
Right.
been it, it's almost been 4 years since she went to the builder to ask to start building it.
It goes to the heart of why Jerome talks about regulations. Jerome Brook talks about why regulations are probably more harmful to an economy's growth than taxes, right? Because you can tax it 30%, and then maybe it'll be 30% more expensive, but you still get it done in a couple of months. Like right now, their financing is on pause. Any debt that they took on in order to finance this construction project is still accumulating interest, and it's not going, they're not going to be able to go towards the people that they've hired. There's workers that are on standby waiting to get paid for work that they're not able to start yet.
It's a bit hard to tax something when it's not there because it hasn't been
Right.
approved yet. It's hard for someone to be taxed to pay income tax when they don't have a job because they're still waiting for that contract to go through to build the house, but the house that they need to build is still in the approval process.
It's just economically so harmful, and not to mention harmful to people's personal lives. Like I imagine, say you have another kid and you need that extra bedroom, right? Like that harms people's everyday lives, and also their pocketbook for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
This is something that goes to the heart of what I find very interesting about these polls we were looking at, which is that it does seem like young people are aware. Young people are shifting in favor of, for example, nuclear energy and away from, a lot of them expressed at much higher rates, although still not high enough, that they think a lot of the reason why the energy prices are going out of control are because of government restrictions on oil and gas developments, for example. So like I get that this is going to be kind of a skewed sample because obviously somebody who joins the young liberals is going to be more ideologically inclined to agree with us on a lot of these issues than a
Mhm.
normal sample of young people. But like, could you talk a little bit about maybe even just like case by case, policy by policy, or also just general sympathies that you've encountered from younger people that make you optimistic about the trends?
Yeah. So a lot of young people support nuclear energy, which in Australia, as I mentioned in my article on the Objectivist blog, is that it's currently illegal in Australia, right? I know it sounds crazy that that a developed nation, the only one in the G20 to actually have a ban on the cleanest, safest, and most reliable energy source that humans have ever created to date.
The fuel for which that you produce basically 30% of the world's supply of, right? 30% of the world's uranium production is in Australia, but you can't actually use it for yourselves.
No, which is just seems diabolical to me. And you're
Yeah.
right. Within Western Australia and Northern Territory, we have 1/3 of the world's reserves of uranium. Like we could easily start producing fuel rods and start to be more actively involved in the nuclear fuel cycle by enriching uranium to for fuel for reactors and then exporting that overseas and value adding to our raw materials here in Australia because Australia produces everything under the sun in terms of raw materials: iron ore, gold, copper, etc., silver. Like the list just goes on and on and on of what we produce, but yet the problem is we export it all overseas and then it comes back as a steel beam. Now, I'll blame the reason why this is occurring is because of the insane regulations around foreign investment into this country and also the taxes as well. The Labor Party talks about how they want to get manufacturing up. Okay, great, that's great. Everyone wants manufacturing, right? But it's how you get there and how you actually get there. The Labor Party's idea is to fund taxpayer money into subsidies and into infrastructure and whatnot to actually try and get it up. But that never works. The reason why in Australia we had a manufacturing industry in the first place is because of inefficiencies created by protectionist policies, subsidies and tariffs on cars, for example. But if you actually went the other way and you deregulated foreign investments requirements and you incentivize people to come here with the tax code, i.e., reduce taxes, you can then get big companies like like Tesla, for example, could come down here. Uh, Rolls-Royce can come down here and start producing their small modular reactors right here in Australia, and then use the fuel that is being processed in Australia and export that around the world to Asian markets, because that would be much more cost effective for Rolls-Royce to have an operation here and then send the fuel from here to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, India, and because then they don't have to ship it from Australia to the UK and then back out again. And that's the current scenario now with essentially everything that Australia gets imported. So all our cars and stuff is made with Australian materials, but yet we are struggling to use it here because the regulations and the cost input, and energy is a major part of that.
Hmm.
Right now, across Australia, essentially, especially on the eastern seaboard, for states like Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales, are all connected on the same grid. So the factory that produces cheesels, for example, a famous Australian snack, you should try it, by the way,
Mm.
their power bill is going from 7 million a year to 15 million a year overnight. And you wonder why we're losing manufacturing. It's because we don't have reliable, affordable power. And if you're concerned about climate change, which most young people are, nuclear is the answer for that, and that's great because that feeds into the economic freedom ideology that if you reduce regulation, if you reduce taxes, society will be better off, and that's what I'm really looking forward to. Um, as I said in my intro, for young people, because they realise that, hang on, this government intervention stuff, it isn't working as intended. We need to go the other way to get rid of this, to allow people to do what they see fit. Enforce
Right.
property rights, reduce taxes, reduce regulation, actually have more people, actually have more money in people's pockets so that they can spend on what they see fit.
Right. And so I think, I mean, I'm definitely with you on that. I'm just, what I find kind of interesting is that unlike a lot of Western countries, it seems like a lot of young people, more so than their elders, are with you on that too. So I think one of the things I find interesting is that post-election, you have this gentleman, Peter Dutton, who's been around in the Australian system for a while, pretty right wing relative to the previous government, relative to really most of the Australian right wing leaders in a while, take over. A lot of the moderates get decimated. And there seems to be, in that sense, it's kind of a top down movement towards just generally more conservative in the American sense. So on the economy, more right wing, but also he's seen as like a culturally right wing figure too. But there's also this bottom up classic liberal movement for more freedom. So do you view those two trends as being in conflict potentially? And do you think that Dutton, or do you think Dutton is more just a vehicle for a lot of these people to enact their more liberal vision? Because he's also a cultural conservative, as I understand it. He's not
Yes.
just So, and obviously that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as it does here in the US, being like a theocrat. I think he probably has some of these sentiments, but I think in Australia you couldn't get away with, for example, enacting a ban on abortion nationwide. So kind of has to play his cards a little close to the chest, right? But
Yeah, but yeah,
he's, yeah,
he's not really religious, but what has influenced him a lot is his background as a cop in Queensland.
I see.
He dealt with a lot of domestic violence and Indigenous issues as a policeman in Queensland, and of course that's going to influence his opinions and his views because the public perception of Dutton isn't that great at the moment because the roles in which Dutton was given when he was in government is in very serious roles such as defence and home affairs, where essentially you're dealing with tanks. For defence, you're obviously dealing with tanks, aircraft, submarines, naval vessels, etc. But in home affairs, you're dealing with a lot of immigrants and people on visas who or dual citizens who break the law. And the perception of Dutton is that he's a very hard man. He's very he doesn't smile. He's not soft at all. He's very like blatantly focused on his job. Um, it's not very positive. But the reason why it's not positive is because he got given jobs that require him not to be positive. I mean, he can't really put a smile on when he's saying, "Oh, this immigrant today has been kicked out of the country for raping a young daughter or something."
Yeah.
Like that's not a job where where you smile. That's a job where you stare down the camera and you say it bluntly to the Australian people as to what's going on because it is a very serious issue because you deal with some sensitive cases as Home Affairs Minister, um, like blocking visas for ISIS people. That's not a very smiley, positive job, and
Right.
that's what's done. That's what Dutton has had throughout his entire political career. But now that he's leader of the opposition, and now that he's done a few media things, he's broadened his expansion. He's broadened his policy area more significantly because as leader of the opposition, you have to talk about everything. Like his budget reply speech to the budget was absolutely wonderful. He talked about the culture war, he talked about the education system, he talked about family businesses, he talked about energy policy, he talked about industrial relations, and he talked to his soft side as well about the story of how he let in 4,000 women who were escaping ISIS tyranny. And
Mhm.
he really appealed to people's emotions about that. It shows that he's actually emotional, like every other human being, but he has conviction as well, which is fresh to see because like he's really pushing the nuclear boat, which is great because the Liberal Party's never done that. The Liberal Party has never done what it's set out to do in its we believe statement of choice, right? Like, okay, it believes in choice, but does nothing about lifting a ban on something. Like
Mhm.
that's pretty ironic to me. And no wonder people leave the Liberal Party. But now that he's in and we've got rid of the old leadership, this is a good time for the Liberal Party to actually go back to its grassroots of classical liberalism and individual freedom which the party was essentially based on when Robert Menzies set up the party. I mean, we call the Liberal Party, for God's sake. It refers
Right.
to classical liberalism, i.e., individual freedom, economic freedom, um, minimal intervention in the economy, allowing the individual to take on their potential and to have more control of their lives. But also, if you're someone who can't necessarily do that on your own, there's a mutual obligation to the government if you receive welfare, for example. So you have to do just a little bit of work to ensure that everyone gets the best outcome, but there's more emphasis on the individual within the Australian society, which Peter Dutton will do.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of positive trends there. I mean, you mentioned things like zoning are obviously more of an issue at the local level. So there's not as much that the federal government can do about those sorts of things. Although I think, if I understand it correctly, the Australian government can preempt state regulations. There's a provision in the Australian Constitution that allows them to do that and say, no, 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 the states can't regulate this. The federal government has jurisdiction over this, and we're going to legalize nuclear power nationwide, for example, and the states can't ban it. Right, like there is it what is it? Section 134 of the Australian Constitution allows the federal government to say, all right, states, you can't do this.
I think it's
Or
section
Section 140.
9.
Okay.
Yeah, here we go.
Um,
Section 109, inconsistency of
okay.
laws. When a law of a state is inconsistent with a law of the Commonwealth, the latter shall prevail, and the former shall, to the extent of the inconsistency, be invalid.
Right. So we have something similar in the United States called the Commerce Clause, where if there's a matter to do with federal interstate commerce, that the federal government has acted on to the same thing, to the extent that the state law is inconsistent with it, state law is invalidated. We also have the 14th Amendment, which allows the federal government to legislate on matters of individual rights, and to the extent that that's inconsistent with state law, the state law will be invalidated.
Yep.
And I think that could be a vehicle. Obviously, there would be controversy with that, but I guess what sort of interests me the most is that the young people are more freedom minded and they're more like liberal in the
Yeah.
classical sense than their elders.
Yeah.
And I do think this kind of confirms a suspicion that I have that like the reason why young people vote for leftists in a lot of Western countries is because they're idealists and the right is seen as a more pragmatic, pragmatist, unprincipled party. In the British Conservative Party versus the Labour Party, for example, the American Republicans versus the Democrats. And young people do, it's true, have pretty progressive and I think really more liberal views on things like race, things like personal choice issues, such as, again, abortion in the United States,
Hmm.
historically, gay marriage being an issue.
Hmm.
And it does seem like the liberals in Australia, much more so than their sort of Anglosphere equivalents, the center right parties of Canada, the US, Britain, has been on the right side of the more progressive side of history on a lot of these issues, and have gotten flack for it from the more socially conservative faction. So I think
Yeah.
in charting a course for the future, and it does seem like you've had personal success in sort of taking over with your like-minded compatriots some of the institutions of the party, like the local party organizations, the young liberal organization in your area, with people who are more like-minded on freedom.
Yeah.
And I know that, yeah, it seems like that's kind of the way forward. The reason they lost is because they weren't posing an alternative that was positive. The reason that the Republicans in America lost the other night, a lot of races that they should have won, were because they were floating candidates that were either conspiratorial or frankly anti-freedom on a lot of issues, not least of which the economy, but also abortion. Um, and they weren't articulating a positive message. So do you see that shifting? Do you see the party shifting towards here's our agenda and actually having,
Yes.
famously you had Houston put together Fight
Mhm.
Back in the early 90s. And while I don't see Dutton issuing a 500-page report on the economic policies he would implement, I do think they're in that direction of here's what our agenda is. And it might not be a great one, but it seems like it's a good one.
Yeah,
What are like the most positive things that you've seen coming
yeah.
out besides
So
the nuclear issue?
yeah, Peter, like obviously being thrown into opposition is tough. Opposition is a
Mhm.
very tough position um, to be in because essentially, like especially the start of it is really hard because the party's lost, right? It's lost the
Yeah.
electorate, it's lost its policies, it's lost its direction, right? There's no, you essentially don't know what to do, right?
But
Except
because of the
for,
preference system, like you mentioned, the Labor Party did not get a thumping endorsement of its policies either. So it does seem like there's a big middle ground of people who just don't really like anybody right now, at least in the last election.
yeah, like both major parties had a swing against them. Like
Right.
Labor went backwards by 0.5%. Liberal National Coalition went backwards by 5.6 or something.
And that's on
And
the
a lot of
first
those,
preference votes.
yes, and a lot of votes went
Yeah.
to Greens and Independents.
Right.
But yes, going into opposition is very hard. Being opposition leader is
Mhm.
probably the most difficult job in history because it's very hard to come up with policies at the start. It's very hard to offer an alternative at the start because at the start, you're essentially just trying to poke holes into the government's plans and agenda and policy agenda and legislation. And then from there, you slowly build up to policy. But Peter Dutton has quickly offered policy to the Australian people. For example, allowing first home buyers to access their super if they see fit. If the individual sees fit to access their super, which is a government mandated program in Australia where I think the rate is now up 10.10.5% of your wages is paid into an account where that account is then invested into stocks and other investments to try and get a dividend off it. And then when you reach retirement age, you then have access to that money, and that's a big amount of money, so that there's less pressure on the welfare system, on the pension system, to ensure that it's economically sustainable for people to retire. Um, but young people can take money out of that fund and put it towards a house. And that's one of the things that the Liberal Party is very committed to, and which I am happy about because it gives people choice. If people want to risk that future earnings to have a house now, by all means, be my guest. But if you don't want to, that's fine.
Mhm.
And Peter Dutton has put emphasis on having an intelligent debate about nuclear, um, which there is now a bill in the upper house in the Senate to actually legalise it, and it's been put forward by the coalition. So that means that it must have had the tick of Peter Dutton, who's the coalition leader. But there are other policies as well that the um, that Peter Dutton hinted at, which is especially around the curriculum, around the educational curriculum of pushing back against like the woke stuff, the for example, like changing sex education as well to have it less sort of woke. But to me, the education is a really sensitive topic because I think that education should be dumbed down to the basics, especially government enforced curriculum. It should just be math, English, science, and that's essentially it. Um, and then it should be up to the schools to determine what the curriculum is at their individual schools so that there's competition within the market for parents to then shop around. And if they don't like curriculum one school, they can just simply go to another if they see fit. And Dutton sort of hinted that in his budget reply speech. Um, but he also restated the coalition's pledge to have more immigrants coming to Australia, especially skilled migrants. Um, but as I said, in the first budget reply speech is part of the early stage of opposition, in which where it is difficult to come up with policy because the party's still lost. They don't know, and obviously policy development takes time, right? So like the Liberal Party of Western Australia, which I belong to, we only have a state conference once a year, and that's the only time in the calendar year when we talk about policy motions, and it takes a long time for those policy motions to filter through up to the leadership, especially under the last leadership. But it's relatively quicker now. But that's because I guess we're in opposition, so we don't have to worry about government as much. But it does take time to develop policies and develop modelling and costings of those policies
Mhm.
whilst in opposition. I mean, it took 9 years for Labor to get back into government. Um, Obviously, the circumstances were different then. The last time the coalition lost government was in 2007, um, when Howard lost his own seat, unfortunately. But it took 6 years for the coalition to get back into government. So it takes time to develop policies, and obviously, what your own party offers isn't the only factor in the election. You obviously have multiple factors within the electorate that are going to affect the result. For example, breaking election promises. Labor have already broken multiple election promises, such as lowering your electricity bill by $275, such as not implementing multi-employer bargaining. They've also promised a whole bunch of specific infrastructure projects that they've taken out of the budget. Um, and that's really easy for an opposition to attack. But at the end of the day, Australians want an alternative, and it does take time to do that. But what's going to help the Liberal Party is if it actually listens to its base, which it's starting to now, especially with policy motions. Like nuclear is a big step because of every single year that I've been involved in the Liberal Party since 2018, there has been a motion about nuclear energy to legalise it. It flies through the party room. And did the leadership do anything about it? No. But since Dutton has gotten in charge, he's actually started to do that now, and he's finally listened to the party base. And if the party base is supported by the leader, and the leader supports the party base, policy development becomes a lot quicker because you're all relatively on the same page. You know the direction of the Liberal Party, which principally is going towards more the economically to the more economically free side. So reducing taxation, reducing regulation, bringing more investment into Australia through those ways. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to the next election because the Liberal Party will actually be more liberal. And even at a state level, we have multiple policy committees for areas because at the last election, the last WA election, we had dreadful policies that was not supported by the party base. For example, we had plans to shut down the shut down a major coal-fired power station here in WA a lot earlier than what Labor had pledged, replace renewables. And if that came up in the party room, it would get shot down like there's no tomorrow. Um,
Mhm.
so we've actually engaged with the party base now to have policy committees, and I'm on the energy committee. I'm obviously pushing for nuclear and more gas as well as a transition fuel because renewables simply don't work at the large scale that they've been promised at. Look at Germany, look at Europe, look at California, your home state, for example,
Yeah.
where it's just uh, it's an absolute cluster F word because renewables simply just can't provide the power when it is needed. but the problem is they provide the power when it's not needed, and it just makes the grid really unstable. But I'm I'm overall happy with the direction of the Liberal Party because they have taken the lessons of multiple elections to say, hang on, we've lost the WA election by going too left wing. We've lost the federal election by going too left wing. We're probably going to lose the New South Wales and Victorian elections because we've gone too left wing. We need to go back to our party base. We need to go back to the days of a more Tony Abbott style, um, more right wing approach to policies in Australia, to politics in Australia, to have more economically free, principle orientated policies to actually appeal to middle income Australia, to have cheaper housing, to have cheaper power bills, to have cheaper goods and services, to have a stronger household budget because 50%, 58% of people polled this year said that the priority of the federal government is to reduce power household bills. It's not to reduce emissions, it's not to prevent blackouts, it's to keep keep energy prices low because at the end of the day, people are worried if they're going to have food on their table or not. They don't necessarily care about the environment, they just care about their individual circumstances and their family and friends who are cared by them, who are dearly loved by them to have a good life. And this is where Ayn Rand's philosophy of self rational interest comes in, where hang on. So I'm a Queenslander at the 2019 election. Okay, Labor and the Greens wants to kill my job. The Liberal and National Coalition want to keep my job by opening a new coal mine. I'm going to vote Liberal because I want food on the table. I want a head over my roof. A roof over my head. I want my kids to go in a nice warm bed every single night. I want my streets safe. I want a good neighbourhood, and that means that the best way to do that is to get people jobs. Therefore, I'm voting Liberal National at this election. That's exactly why we won the last election, and we need to go back to.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people are like that. I think that the problem that a lot of center right governments are having is that they're not able to make that case persuasively because there are very few issues on which they've done that. And to your point, in the sort of bottom up way, if the Liberal Party fights elections at the state level and the local level on those issues of deregulating zoning, for example, and jump-starting the building process and reducing the permitting processes and the onerous burdens that are required for new housing developments, that'll be a tangible way for them to make that case. And the federal party will be able to say, look at what we did at the state level in New South Wales. Look at what we did in Queensland. Look at what we did in WA. I know in WA, for example, it might be a while before you guys are back in government again, but I mean, at the very least, gaining that credibility in a bottom-up way, and starting at the state and local level, and not to mention you're building a sort of bench of people that can then be promoted from the state level into the federal parliament. But one of the things I find actually really fascinating about Australia and that I like to use because one of my pet issues is education and choice. This is
Yep.
one of the key places that you can make a really big difference and make that a really core part of your governing agenda and working to appeal to the sort of, in America, we call them soccer moms, who are probably the prototypical heel independent voter from the last election. They're usually middle to upper middle class. They live in suburbs or in the cities. They tend to be center to center right on a lot of issues. They want clean, transparent, good government. Maybe they care about the environment. So, I mean, again, we can talk till we're blue in the face about using nuclear as an issue, but school choice.
You're essentially talking about voters who voted teal at the last
Sure.
election in those inner city seats. Yeah.
And they felt disaffected by the government who didn't seem to really be working on issues that were important to them. And I think one issue that the Liberal Party, and again, this might be rose tinted glasses, but I read a lot about school choice and I read a lot about charter schools and just more generally creating a market in education, vouchers, tax credits, you name it,
Yeah.
educational savings account. And I'm convinced that we need an all of the above strategy to really build a market in education. And one thing that the Liberal Party has historically, granted, it was probably for pragmatic reasons, but going back to post World War II, going back to Menzies himself, was one of their cornerstone policies was providing school choice and going to particularly Catholics who might have been often immigrants from places like Ireland who would have been the prototypical labor, working class voters and saying, we'll either subsidize the school or we'll give you money to help pay for your kid's scholarship. We'll subsidize the charities that provide scholarships for these kids. And there were a variety of different mechanisms. And again, a lot of it was probably for just getting votes. But Australia has really been a leader in providing alternatives. I believe, according
Yeah.
to this
Never
one
gone back.
survey, we had 30%, oh no, over a third of Australian students are in private schools, which is significantly higher than most developed countries and over 3 times the percentage of US students in private schools. So that's a record to really be proud of and to build on. And it doesn't seem like the Liberal Party takes enough credit for that and their historical role in doing that. So, like, do you see that as being a winning issue going into the next election, saying we're going to really make this a more dynamic environment? I mean, choosing the school that your kids go to, that's one of the most fundamental choices that somebody can make in their life
Yeah.
is giving their kid a quality education. And again, depending on how you frame it, you can't be, you know, unhinged and talk about like creating a market in education necessarily, but talk about empowering parents to choose the schools that they want for their kids. You don't want woke ideology in your kid's school? Fine, go to a Catholic school. Fine, go to an independent school. Do,
Yeah.
do
And
you
here's a
see
voucher,
that
and here
being
and here's a taxpayer-funded voucher. You got to do it
right?
if you can't
And
afford it.
exactly. Do you see that being something that the Liberal Party apparatus is interested in? And do you see that being something that would play well to the general public in
Yes.
Australia?
Yes. Yes. Definitely. So Peter Dutton talks about the forgotten people, which is in the
Mhm.
suburbs, right? And of course, in the suburbs, you're going to have what you described as soccer mums who, have a couple of kids, mortgage to pay off, go uh, to their local school, whether it be private or public or whatever they see fit at the time. They work 9 to 5, just a job or whatever. And yes, this is most definitely a issue in which the Liberal Party can easily take advantage of compared to the Labor Party because education, uh, since I can remember, hasn't really been an electoral issue. It
Mhm.
hasn't been an issue except for funding and building X and Y Z school, like not in terms of the structure of the funding. I mean, like Australia now has plenty of money in education. Um, what the Liberal Party should be looking at is a program where they essentially cut all funding to schools, and instead of giving it to the schools, they give it to the parents of the kids. And this is completely optional as well. If you don't want to have a voucher, you don't you don't have to have a voucher. For example, people who send their kids um, to private schools may not necessarily want vouchers because they don't need vouchers, right? Um, because if you can cover the school fees, you don't necessarily need the voucher. But for people who can't cover the cost of a school, that's where vouchers would help. They can shop around. They can say, "No, I don't like that public high school. To the government provided high school. I'm going to go to a private one. Or I really like that public high school. that's government provided. But however, I'm going to go to the other public private high school in my local area because they have a better curriculum, because the government has allowed the school to set its own curriculum outside of science, English, and maths. Right? They don't talk about the woke stuff. They have a good sexual education program, for example, um, and they don't really talk about religion. But and then if you have like a Catholic mum, for example, or Catholic family, they can go, I'm going to go to this Catholic school because they they stick to the curriculum well that they have there, which is science, math, and English, obviously, as per government mandates. But also, they don't really talk about sexual education that much. They talk about heterosex only, for example, and it will also incentivize teachers because and if you have good teachers, that means you have a good curriculum and a good delivery of that curriculum as well, essentially, right? And that means that the poorer kids who couldn't necessarily afford to go to that good school before the vouchers is now able to go there, which means they have more opportunity in life, which means that they have can go, which means that they can have a better life. And it goes back to Iran's philosophy of exploiting opportunities to their maximum, right? And if you have a good educational background, a good basic understanding of science, math, and English, you will do well in your life and in your career. And but that's only going to happen if the Liberal Party actually takes that as a policy to the Australian people, because we can make an electoral issue if we wanted to. But as I said before, I can't really remember a time when education was front and mind for the electorate, and we can really tap into that and tap into that potential source, and that could possibly get back into government in 2025. We just don't know until you try, and this is something that the Liberal Party should look into because there is a lot of lack of policy around the area. Um, because at the state conferences, there is barely any policy motions on the funding structure of education. I think that is something that we can really tap into. Um, hasn't Arizona got really good? Hasn't Arizona got a good voucher system?
Arizona did recently implement a very broad, wide-reaching, and I think very positive reform to education. One of the main things was the creation of tax-free educational savings account. Arizona has been kind of a leader in the way of having school choice and having vouchers. So my understanding of it was that this would allow the parents of about 1.2 million school-age children to get 90% of the state money that would normally go to their public school. And then they can take that money and use it for a private school or another school
Yeah,
cost. So that turns out to be about $7,000 a year for your non-disability, your average student.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's
and I think
huge.
that yeah, I think that's something that the Liberal Party should definitely look into because it goes back to that liberal philosophy of choice, individual, the emphasis on the individual, and and economic freedom as well, because you still have the choice of going around to different schools and shopping around, which will hence improve competition and innovation. Because
Yeah.
if you're looking at right in Australia, the most heavily involved, sorry, the where the government is most involved in the industries of healthcare and education, that's the sectors where there is least innovation and competition, right? So if you
Mhm.
free it up even just a little bit, everyone's going to benefit, especially in the long run, because everyone will have a relatively competitive market in which, relatively speaking, there will be better teachers and more innovation about educational methods, which will improve student outcome, which will improve Australia's.
Yeah, and I'm all there with you on that. I think that the only issue to consider, and I don't see it as an issue per se, but something to keep in mind is that, we talk a lot about, you and I, about unions and the role that they have in thwarting a lot of major reforms like deregulations, like, for example, the coal union lobby, the miners' unions, and so forth, I think have played a pretty big role in thwarting the development of nuclear energy. So you're definitely going to get pushback from the teachers' unions on that. So one of the ways that you can do an end run around the unions is by, again, making the case to the parents. But it is going to be a tough fight, and they're going to be well organized, and they're going to have a lot of money that they're going to spend on, like you saw with
Campaigning.
work choices and the labor movement against work choices in the mid 2000s under John Howard. So, I mean, this might make that look like child's play if you were to try to go wholesale, like whole hog on education reform. So, do you think that it would be possible or even politically necessary to go for industrial relations reform first as a prerequisite to some of these reforms? Could you combine the educational tax credit program with industrial relations reform? Obviously, the particulars might depend on how big a role the crossbench has to play in the Senate in the next parliament. But even assuming you get a solid coalition majority, everybody votes the party line in the next government. Do you think that would be desirable or necessary to link the education reform with union reform?
I'm not quite sure about that one because if you're going to do, because this is where it gets really complicated here in Australia. You still have the state government, in
Right.
education as well. Like the federal government only provides about $40 billion in educational funding or something, and the states provide the other 40 odd or something. So this is where it's going to become an absolute mess, because industrial relations issues can be both controlled by state and federal governments, and because the teachers' pay is set by the state government in WA. And so I guess at a federal level, you probably could get away with a voucher system and not worry about the unions as much. But with the new Labor bill, with the new bill that Labor introduced, the new industrial relations bill, which will allow multi-employer bargaining, we'll have to address that issue anyway. Um, so to answer your question on consideration of those factors, probably not, because it won't be required to do it together. Um, you probably could get away with, yeah, yeah, I think you probably could get away with um, a voucher system at the federal level, not worry about unions,
Mm-hmm.
because yeah, it's done by the states. The wages are set by the states, and the funding that the states get sometimes comes from the federal government. But if you change it to a voucher system, they're still going to get that funding anyway, but it's just going to be allocated differently according to what the parents want, if you get what I mean.
Well, because you'd be giving at least some of the general funds back to the parents, yeah.
Yes, which
Um,
then go back into the school system because you're paying the school, which is provided by the state government, which will then in turn um, give more money to that particular school, which means that they could afford to hire better teachers than to increase the pay of the ones that they've got.
Right. I guess the way that it works in America is for every public school student that leaves the public school system, you that school loses funding. So this is like one of the principal cases that the unions and their defenders will make is that by creating a voucher system, what you're basically doing is you're taking money away from the public schools. That's the way they'll frame it. And you'll be giving it indirectly to the private school. You'll be using taxpayer funds to basically prop up private schools. That's the way that they're going to frame it.
Well, but you could also
Um,
reframe it and say, hang on,
it's the parents'
you,
money. They're the ones paying the taxes.
but also you can reframe it to the teachers and say, hang on, there is going to be a need to increase the capacity of teachers in terms of numbers and qualities at those schools. You can be rehired at our school and get a better wage and a better working conditions because of the vouchers that the government have introduced. That's the way you look at
Right.
it.
Right. And there's like public or not public, I'm sorry, charter schools in New York, which are kind of a hybrid model. They receive government funding. And I believe they're tuition free most of the time. And yet they have no unions. They have a lot more flexibility than pure government schools in terms of setting the curriculum. And the teachers are at will employees, meaning they can be fired in the middle of the year, like that day. There's no process for firing them. It's just, oh, principal says you're fired. You're out of here. But they make like 150K starting. So a proposition like that to a teacher, Steve Jobs gave an interview in the 90s where he talks about why don't we give a tax credit or a voucher to parents? And not only will that create this market in education, but also you'll have people who will graduate from business school with an MBA and say, you know what, rather than starting a more conventional like tech company or something like that, I'm going to start a school. You
Yeah.
have the profit motive,
And guess
and you
what?
might make a lot of money.
That's going to increase competition and quality within the market, which means that
Right.
everyone's going to be, it's a win-win, as Young Book would say.
Yeah. So right, and that's a social transformation, and I think also like there's a lot of leftists that will, in some sense, have some truth in their criticism in the sense that this is going to make people think about everything differently potentially, because if you have a society that thinks of education as a product that's bought and sold on a market, then potentially everything's up for grabs. So I think doing the end run around the states by creating a voucher system at the federal level could potentially be a solution. I think that that's something that I'm pushing for really hard because I think you don't get wholesale social and cultural change without that. I think it's also not a coincidence that Australian young people are trending in the right direction when a third of them are enrolled in private schools. I think that's the kind of cultural transition that needs to take place if you want to see a dynamic, ever freer country and culture, a movement towards individualism and towards freedom. That's going to require private schooling. Yeah, there's going to be some parents that choose to send their kids to religious schools, but ultimately, those religious schools are going to be limited in how much they can try to brainwash the kids by the market. Because if the parents see that they're not producing better outcomes than more secular schools on the curriculum, they're going to take their kids out, a lot of them. So I think there's a huge opportunity here. I mean, what we're talking about in the fight for freedom is a multi-generational fight. It's one that I think we'll live to see. But I think the education, that might be the biggest issue. I think it is the biggest issue politically. And it's the one that,
Especially long term.
yeah, right. And I think we can talk about deregulation of everything else until we're blue in the face. But I think ultimately, not only to have durable, long lasting reforms in every other area and building a constituency for that, but also just in terms of real dynamic social change, you're going to need educational reform and you're going to need wholesale privatization eventually of the education system. And I think that any step towards that is a huge one that
Yeah.
we really need to capitalize on. Do do you hear young people, even the more like-minded ones, talking about this? Do you think that they would be? I mean, obviously, people in their 20s are not going to be as focused on the K through 12 education system as people in their mid to late 30s who are starting a family. But like, do you think they could get energized and excited about something like this?
I definitely think so because obviously we're still relatively fresh out of school. The school system has significantly deteriorated since we have graduated, since my year group has graduated in 2019. So for example, only 1 in 10 year 8 boys couldn't read or something, couldn't read and write properly. It's now 1 in 3. And that was only a couple of years ago. So
Hmm.
there needs to be a conversation around reforming the funding of education because there's plenty of funding there. It's just incredibly inefficient at the moment. And when you go to the individual level, it's a lot more efficient because you're going to the individual's needs and what they see fit, not what the government sees fit.
Hmm.
And this is something that I personally will be pushing within the Liberal Party um, over the next few months to try and get somewhere with this because I think that, as I said before, is an untapped potential that we could tap into at from electoral perspective to get us back into government sooner rather than later.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think it's going to be a long fight, and I think from the sound of it, there's people who are on the ground ready to take up that fight and take up that banner of more freedom. And
Yeah,
you know,
and 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 and, and especially young people, they are seeing other young people push against what the left is proposing. Like younger senators like Alex Antic and even older ones like Senator Rennick are pushing against what the left is saying. They go, no, hang on. And that's inspiring people like you and me to talk about this more and to actually have more of effect on society if we get control of government or at least have a big influence on government making policy.
that's awesome. And I think, that's a fantastic note to close on because I think that things are moving in the positive direction in at least one English speaking country. And I think we should pay attention and we should take notes. I think that in America, it's very easy to get kind of myopically focused on what's going on here. But I think paying attention to places like Australia that are on the front line of freedom, both, domestically and also geopolitically, you guys are really, I would argue, a frontline state in the same way that Britain or Germany was in the Cold War with everything that's going on with China right now. So I think that's a beacon of hope in kind of a very mixed at best situation in the Western world right now. And we'll watch closely and take note. And whatever we can do to help in the fight in Australia, I think we should do.
Yeah. And Australia's always been the one that's supposedly lagging behind the rest of the world in terms of all this cultural stuff. And I think it's about time that Australia actually stepped up to the plate and have a proper conversation about reforms, especially in education, to make the world a much better place and be the, as you say, the beacon of the world in terms of educational structures.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we'll watch closely. Again, I think that any education reform advocate should pay close attention. So, with that, thank you very much, Greg.
Yes, thank you, Marcus.
We'll
Yeah.
definitely, yeah, and we'll definitely do this again. And Greg will be on just like always from time to time. So, thanks very much. That, good night.